What is universalism? Universalism refers to the idea that the range of human experience, from basic needs and psychological processes to core values, is generalizable and similar across all humans and cultures. It supports the idea that everyone should follow the same laws and have the same rights, regardless of differences such as race, gender, or class. What is cultural relativism? It refers to the ability to understand a culture in its own context and to not make judgments using the standards of one's own culture. It leads to the view that one's culture is not better than the other when it comes to law or politics. It aims to promote understanding of different cultural practices that may not be part of one's own culture. Universalism and cultural relativism are different to each other but interconnected. Universalism highlights the importance of shared human experiences, whereas cultural relativism emphasizes that there are differences in culture and values based on tradition, history, and norms. However, there is some tension between these perspectives, as critics of universalism express that dominant groups establish values based on their own limited perspectives, which can set up standards that suggest that others are atypical or dysfunctional. Critics of cultural relativism argue that if each culture sets its own rules, it becomes difficult to fight for consistent rights and protection. Additionally, this may block efforts towards enforcing standards for marginalized groups such as Indigenous peoples who have historically faced unequal treatment and systemic discrimination.
The psychological theory we will be dissecting today is Erikson's stages of psychosocial development. The theory presents a lifespan model of development from infancy to late adulthood. It is composed of 8 stages that are each influenced by biological, psychological, and social factors. The first stage occurs during infancy and is named trust versus mistrust. During this stage, it is important that the infant's primary caregiver provides a secure environment. If this is achieved, the infant will obtain trust. If the stage of development is not met, then the infant will withdraw or become anxious. The second early childhood stage is named autonomy versus shame. This stage relies on the child achieving tasks by themselves with the support of the caregiver. If the stage is achieved, the child will obtain the will and confidence to perform tasks. If not, they may acquire doubt. The third stage occurs during the play age and focuses on initiative versus guilt. This stage relies on the child taking initiative or control when playing or in social interactions. If this is achieved, they will gain the virtue of initiative. If not, then they may have inhibition. The fourth school-age period is named industry versus inferiority. This depends on whether the child meets reasonable goals set out in either home or school and whether they receive praise for their accomplishment. If developed, the child gains a sense of competence. If not, they may feel inferior or passive. The fifth stage starts in adolescence and is named identity versus confusion. Here, a teenager must explore their personal identity, including their belief, value, and role. Success in the stage achieves fidelity, which includes a stable identity. If not achieved, an adolescent may reject society. The sixth stage occurs in young adulthood, named intimacy versus isolation. In this stage, the formation of close friendships and partnerships is crucial. When achieved, the individual will gain the virtue of love. If not, they may become isolated. The seventh adulthood/middle age stage is named generativity versus stagnation. This stage focuses on contributing to society and interacting with younger generations. When achieved, individuals will gain the virtue of care. If not, the individual may become self-absorbed. The eighth and final stage is old age or late adulthood, named integrity versus despair. This stage involves an individual reflecting on the life they have led and its meaning. If they feel satisfied with this reflection, they gain the virtue of wisdom. If not, they may feel disdain and regret. These stages all contribute to the development of an individual and their personality.
Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, while foundational to developmental psychology, are heavily shaped by Western cultural norms, particularly the value placed on individualism over collectivism. This model assumes that psychological health is tied to autonomy and self-identity, rather than relational belonging or communities' defined roles, which are foundational in many indigenous worldviews. It also reflects a linear, compartmentalized view of time and development, in contrast to cyclical and interconnected understandings of life and growth observed in indigenous cultures. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander concepts of self are not centered on maternal identity and information, but on relational belonging, connection to country, and fulfilling cultural obligations. Erickson's model therefore promotes a culturally specific standard of healthy development that excludes collectivist cultures. Applying Erickson's model to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people introduces several critical limitations. First, identity for Indigenous Australians is not an individual pursuit, but is embedded in a relational ontology including kinship systems, spiritual connections to country, ancestral ties, and cultural obligations. In this context, Erickson's adolescent stage becomes problematic. The task of forming an individual identity independent from others is not culturally sensitive to Indigenous practices, where identity is formed through community and not in isolation. As Dudgeon noted in 2014, these Western frameworks risk misrepresenting healthy identity development when measured against standards not shared by Indigenous peoples. Secondly, Erickson's stages do not account for the long-lasting effects of hardships Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders experience, such as colonization and the stolen generation. These effects can manifest as intergenerational trauma, the passing on of psychological and emotional effects of trauma from one generation to the next. This has profound implications for developmental outcomes. Research shows that trauma from colonization and state-sanctioned policies continues to impact parenting, identity development, and mental health across generations in Indigenous communities. In their extensive research on the social and emotional well-being of Aboriginal children and youth, in 2014, Zubrick found that the cumulative effects of historical trauma, marginalization, and racism have shaped unique developmental contexts that are widely different from Western norms. Erickson's stages do not reflect these experiences that many Indigenous people, such as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, face. Thus, applying Erickson's model uncritically to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people risks misrepresenting developmental variations as pathological rather than recognizing them as adaptive responses to systemic adversity and culturally distinct norms. The application of Erickson's psychosocial stages in clinical practice has significant implications for treatment and diagnosis when applied on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. A key issue here is that these frameworks are not culturally responsive and are deeply embedded in Western assumptions about identity and development. This has implications not only for validity, but for the perpetuation of systemic racism within psychological practice. As previously mentioned, racism can manifest in the failure to account for the intergenerational effects of historical trauma. These need to be taken into account and should be central to any developmental or clinical framework applied to Indigenous contexts. The universal application of Erickson's model without critical reflection perpetuates a cycle in which Western norms are upheld as superior and Indigenous worldviews are cast aside. It reinforces power imbalances in clinical relationship and contributes to the broader pattern of systemic racism in Australian health systems. It is essential that psychologists recognize these dynamics and engage with culturally grounded frameworks that foreground Indigenous values, knowledge, and strengths.
Hello everyone. Today I want to briefly explore how mainstream psychology often assumes a universal lens and why that's problematic. The limits of universalism. Most psychological theories we learn about have been developed in Western contexts, specifically from what Henry and colleagues we call the weird populations, that is, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. These theories often reflect individualistic, cognitive, and medicalized models of the mind. But these frameworks don't necessarily reflect how people in other cultures, particularly Indigenous communities, understand health, relationships, and the self. As Hendrik pointed out, what we label as human psychology is often just a narrow slice of human experience, so using these frameworks as a default runs the risk of pathologizing or misunderstanding people from other cultural backgrounds. An example of a culturally grounded alternative is the SEWB model developed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. This model views well-being as a balance between many domains, mind and body, but also family, community, spirituality, ancestry, and country. It recognizes that healing can't be separated from social context, and it acknowledges the ongoing impacts of colonization, historical trauma, and systematic injustice. SEWB is all about wholeness. It doesn't isolate mental health from the rest of life. It weaves it into culture, identity, and belonging.
Another beautiful concept is Daderi, which comes from the Gangi Kurunkur people and was shared widely by Miriam Rose. Daderi is about deep listening, not just to others, but to ourselves, the land, and the rhythms of life. It's a form of inner stillness and respectful attention. Rather than jumping to fix problems, Daderi invites us to be present with pain, to listen, and to honor the time it takes for healing to unfold. In therapeutic work, this kind of respectful stillness can be much more powerful than rushing towards clinical diagnosis or intervention. Indigenous models of mental health care. The review led by Nasir highlights that successful indigenous mental health models are deeply rooted in holistic frameworks that encompass not just individual but also their relationships with family, community, land, and spirituality. These models prioritize cultural identity and connection to country as central components of well-being. They also found that integrating traditional healing methods such as storytelling, ceremonies, and connection to ancestral knowledge is a common feature of successful mental health models. These practices are not only therapeutic but also reinforce cultural identity. The findings from these review are valuable in showing us how psychology field can design more effective health services for different types of people.
Health promotion is the process of enabling people to increase control over and to improve their health. An Indigenous model of health promotion should take a holistic and community-based approach, as this aligns with their core values. One study has developed a health promotion for the Maori people that incorporates Indigenous icons, as it is thought to be more effective and practiced when terms harmonise with Indigenous worldviews. Others have suggested modifying the Ottawa Charter model to fit an Indigenous perspective of health. The Ottawa Charter is a strength-based approach as it focuses on building resilience, cultural identity, community, and overall health and well-being, rather than focusing on statistics and illness. It has 5 key action areas that aim to improve health. These include building healthy public policy, creating supportive environments, strengthening community action, developing personal skills, and reorienting health services. It also suggests 3 basic strategies to help it reach these action areas. These include advocacy for health, enabling all people to reach their full potential, and mediating between social sectors.
How can psychology be more culturally responsive? In a therapy setting, psychologists can be more culturally responsive through engaging in self-reflection. This is significant as it allows for any suppressed biases to be recognized before it negatively affects clients. Understanding the dynamics of power and privilege and how it has historically disadvantaged Indigenous peoples, it can position the client to feel comfortable sharing experiences. They are likely to develop rapport with the psychologist if they appear transparent and non-judgmental. This is why critical evaluation of oneself is required when practicing psychology. Psychologists need to understand and prioritize individual differences that influence the client's perspectives, such as their social identities and cultural background. This would require the practitioner to acknowledge power dynamics and systemic inequalities on mental health experienced by the client. It would also involve not generalizing the experiences of one client to other clients and making assumptions about their perspectives. Given the history of oppression and discrimination, psychologists must approach the client with humility and awareness of past and present injustices. By taking the time to understand individual differences of the client, this allows for a more inclusive health service. To build on the topic of inclusivity, professionals must be mindful of the language they use with their clients. To promote a more culturally responsive approach, psychologists must avoid defining the client by their diagnosis and invalidating their trauma. Using expressions such as, "Don't worry, that's not a big deal," is highly invalidating as it dismisses the trauma experienced by Indigenous peoples. This can diminish trust as the client will begin to feel misunderstood, which can lead to feeling uncomfortable opening up about their experiences. Therefore, it is important to validate the emotions of the client to make them feel heard, and to encourage sharing experiences without fear of judgment.
To wrap up, Western psychology isn't universal. When working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people or any culturally diverse group, we must center their perspectives, practices, and leadership. We need to move from cultural competence to cultural humility, recognizing what we don't know, listening deeply, and being open to different ways of understanding mental health. As future psychologists, educators, or health professionals, we have a responsibility to decolonize our thinking and support Indigenous led initiatives that truly reflect the communities they serve. Thank you.